So again, there are three parts to the United States' strategy involving three kind of parts of the Army and three different commanding generals that are in charge of those different parts of the plan. The first part involves General Taylor, who we've already talked about. So we already know that General Taylor's forces are in Texas. They were the ones that crossed over into that disputed area somewhere in here. So Taylor is going to continue invading from Texas into northern Mexico. So that's what you see. This map shows some of the major battles and movements. Not that you necessarily need to know them. We're not going to be looking at specific battles, just kind of overall campaigns. And so General Taylor is involved in these efforts to move from Texas into northern Mexico, and he moves very swiftly. He has a lot of quick victories that make him quite popular, and he'll become a big war hero among others in the Mexican War for those early victories. So he is in charge of invading northern Mexico and is having a lot of success with that. Then another object in this, remember, was California, because that was something that the United States wanted going into all of this, and they had failed to get that diplomatically after the whole Slidell thing blew up in their face. And so they take this opportunity to take California by force. And so that is going to be the job of General Stephen Kearny, and it looks like Kearney, but it's pronounced Kearney. General Stephen Kearny is going to be moving westward to capture California with his forces. So all these movements you see here going west towards California in the blue here, all of that is Kearny's forces. Now, Kearny actually has what ends up being a relatively easy job, because before he even arrives in California, before his forces even get there, there was a revolt in California amongst Californians, amongst a lot of the American settlers mostly who already lived there, called the Bear Flag Revolt. So the Bear Flag Revolt was a revolt, obviously a rebellion, an insurrection of Californians. Again, a lot of those American settlers by that point, so this is before the gold rush and all of that, but there were a good number of Americans that had already settled in California for trade, for agriculture, for livestock grazing, things like that. One of the reasons why California was of interest to the United States at that point wasn't because of gold yet. But they, once the war broke out and they were, angry or irritated with the Mexican government, or a lot of them being Americans, knowing that, the United States was attempting to capture this territory, they rebelled against the Mexican government. So much like Texans had done, 10 years before, rebelling against the Mexican government, Californians do that in what's called the Bear Flag Revolt, and they succeeded, at least temporarily. And so they have pretty much already overthrown the Mexican government and taken over control of California themselves prior to the arrival of General Kearny's troops. And they had established, at least temporarily, California as an independent nation called the Republic of California. This never gets recognized by the United States. It's not considered an official country as far as the United States was concerned. They just kind of set themselves up that way until American forces arrive and continue taking over California, and then it gets annexed and all of that. So Kearny actually meets very, very little resistance, and like I said, when he does get there, California is pretty much already under Californian control, which is kind of at least halfway American control, because a lot of them were Americans, and set up this so-called Republic of California. But then Kearny captures it, and that becomes occupied by the United States forces. The third and final part of the plan was to capture Mexico City. Why would Mexico City be of importance? That's the capital of Mexico. So Taylor comes in through northern Mexico, is taking over cities and towns and having a lot of swift victories in northern Mexico. Kearny captures California, while General Winfield Scott is going to be in charge of leading the attack on Mexico City itself, on the Mexican capital. And so if you are looking at the map, this is this movement right here, okay, because Mexico City is right there. So his troops are going to depart New Orleans, sail across the Gulf of Mexico, some of them coming from Texas, but it's an amphibious landing into first one in the United States military history, and arriving in Mexico and then storming Mexico City, which they capture, again, relatively speaking, pretty easily. Again, this whole thing is in the grand scheme of things, not to downplay the violence or the casualties or anything like that, but relatively speaking, it is a short and sweet kind of affair as opposed to some other conflicts, of course, the United States has been and will be involved in the future after this. So Winfield Scott successfully captures Mexico City, and it is occupied by American forces about September or so of 1847, and that is the end of the war. That, of course, results in Mexico's surrender, at least partially, or they're ready to negotiate for peace after that. So you have this three-part strategy that works extremely well, and the United States captures Mexico City, first time the United States captures an enemy capital, resulting in those peace negotiations continuing from there. So the fighting concludes somewhere in 1847, and then over the next couple of months, a peace agreement, of course, is worked out. So this ends up being, as I've said a couple of times, a swift and quick little war for the United States. And some people, saw this as a sign of, confirming manifest destiny, that this was all proving that the United States was meant to have these territories, that the United States was destined to have greatness, proof of American exceptionalism, all that kind of stuff. But let's look at the technical, more specific results of the war. It ends with a peace treaty with Mexico, obviously, called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So that not only ends the fighting, though, but this also results in massive land acquisitions, in a big exchange of land. We know that land and territory is a big, big, big underlying cause of all of this. And so, of course, gaining territory is going to end up being one of the results. So we'll look at that part of it in just a second. But, of course, it ends the war. Also, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico gives up all their claims to Texas. So that is the end of that. They might complain about it every now and again after that, but not very much. But there are no more official complaints or official claims by Mexico to own any part of Texas or anything like that. So they give up all claims to Texas, recognize that officially and forever as part of the United States and so forth. Obviously, the war is going to settle the boundary dispute over Texas. And where do you suppose the boundary is going to be set? At the Rio Grande. So, of course, the treaty, Mexico recognizes the Rio Grande as the official boundary of Texas, or between the United States and Mexico. And then there is the matter of other territory that the United States wants and that Mexico is kind of forced to agree to give up. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo also includes what becomes known as the Mexican Cession. The Mexican Cession is all this territory that you see here in the red. It is basically the southwestern chunk of what is today the United States. It includes, obviously, you can see all of Nevada, all of Utah would eventually become those areas. Obviously, they're not may not be named that yet. But you can see most of Arizona, parts of New Mexico, parts of Colorado, parts of Wyoming in there, and of course, California. The United States does pay for some of it, pays for California outright, but for a much less price than what they were offering before. So there is some payment involved, but it is incredibly cheap. And the United States was offering to pay more for California prior to the war. And in this case, not only gets California for that discounted price, but all of that as well. You can see a huge amount of territory is included in the Mexican Cession. So we call all of this the Mexican Cession, and that's gained from Mexico as the result of the Mexican-American War. This amounted to about half of Mexico's territory. That was about half of their land that they were forced to give up or have to negotiate away as a result of the Mexican War. And again, it does include California, which is part of what the United States wanted. So with the Mexican Cession and with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, at this point, with the exception of just a couple of little bits and pieces, including this one, which I'll get to in a second, the United States now possesses pretty much all of what is today the continental United States, all of that land from Atlantic to Pacific. The United States is in possession of, again, with a couple of minor exceptions, as a result of the Mexican War. So if we want to think about manifest destiny as this, concept that the United States needed to expand from sea to sea, from Atlantic to Pacific, then the Mexican War accomplishes that. Because the United States does possess all the land all the way to the Pacific Ocean, again with a couple of little exceptions there as a result of the Mexican War. So manifest destiny arguably completed. Now that doesn't mean that manifest destiny advocates say, okay, we're done now. They're still going to want more. And there's still talk of other ways to expand. But we can kind of look at it as certainly the completion of that sort of sea to shining sea sort of concept. Now, it does complete that, but I do want to talk about that another piece of land that is purchased not too long after that, called the Gadsden Purchase. So all that you see there in the red is the Mexican Cession. What you see down there at the bottom, in sort of that yellow or beige, what is the bottom strip of what is today Arizona and New Mexico, that is the Gadsden Purchase. And that was bought from Mexico, purchased from Mexico in 1853. So a few years after the Mexican War, the United States buys that. And certainly with that, the United States definitely has all of what is today the continental United States with that little bit. Now, we're going to talk more about the Gadsden Purchase a little bit later, and some of the other issues that it was related to. For now, we would just say the reason why the United States purchased that was not so much about manifest destiny. Oh, we want to get this last little bit because that ought to be ours because it looks nice. That's not what it's about. It had to do with a railroad. This is getting to the point where the United States is beginning to, by 1853, start making plans. They don't start building yet, but they're starting to make plans to talk about, to start to throw around the idea of a railroad, transcontinental railroad, to go all the way across the country. Now, the United States has got the whole continent. They want to be able to connect East Coast and West Coast by rail. But there are a lot of challenges with that, including the Rocky Mountains. So the Gadsden Purchase was bought because it's flat and or flatter. And so the idea was that if they bought that land, that might be a potentially good route for a transcontinental railroad to go through. Now, that is not where it is going to end up going through, at least not the first one, but keep that in mind about that railroad and where to build it, because that's going to come in shortly. But that was the main motivation for the Gadsden Purchase at that particular time, was because it was flat, and they thought maybe it might be a suitable location to build a transcontinental railroad. So the Mexican War results in multiple things. It is, a huge land acquisition. The United States expands in size a great deal. We can look at it as sort of confirming, for many advocates of manifest destiny, again, this sort of confirmed those beliefs to a lot of those people, showing that the United States was somehow destined for all of this, that it kind of proved that American exceptionalism. I talk about it not being, or being kind of an easy war in the grand scheme of things, and that's easy to say, and that's easy to downplay violence, and it's easy to do all that. When you look at the number of casualties, it's less than 2,000 in the whole war, which doesn't sound like many, and it's not, relatively speaking, but it was one of the deadlier conflicts up until that point. And a lot, sorry, not less than 2,000, less than 20,000. But nevertheless, it was still one of the deadlier conflicts up until that point. A lot of people dying from disease. But it is also, it is, some people, of course, we know, didn't support this whole thing. What were some of the reasons we talked about as to why some Americans were opposed to all of this? Yeah, they saw this as just the United States taking land and being land hungry and being aggressive.
Because that would expand slavery and get more power to the slaves.
Absolutely. There were concerns that this was just like a big conspiracy by slaveholders and slaveholding states, the slave power, as some people called it, to expand slavery and all of that. And so this wasn't, we kind of say, oh, it was quick and easy, but that doesn't mean that everybody was in favor of it. And some people look at this as kind of the first wars of imperialism for the United States, even though the United States probably would not argue itself as an imperial power at this point. But some people saw that as a very, very foreboding sign. This was the United States conquering other lands. It was the United States, taking from someone else, that sort of thing, and ruling over others. Some people were quite worried about that. And also, even though when the war ends in 1848, we have all this land and it seems to be really exciting, we must also remember that this, though, is about to set in motion disputes that are not going to be so easily overcome. Because it is with the Mexican cession and with the acquisition of all this territory that's going to aggravate some other tensions and some other problems that have been there all along. But this is going to bring those things to the surface and cause it to boil over. Because once you have all this new territory, yay, that's exciting, we have new territory to go and settle. But what issue is that going to inevitably bring up? It is going to bring up the slavery issue. That is going to force the slavery issue, something that some people may have thought they could have ignored, that didn't need to be addressed. It is going to push it front and center. And I've mentioned before that, by the 1850s, abolition and slavery overtakes everything else, that it becomes the part of the conversation that is unavoidable. It becomes the thing that overtakes everything else, and it's because of this. This is what causes that to happen. It's because when this westward expansion takes place, now that question has to be answered, and people have very different opinions, obviously, about how that should be done, and it is further agitating that. So it is about to, while it seems like it's just great and happy and wonderful to a lot of folks right here, there is a lot of pride, but this is about to deepen those sectional tensions to a point where they cannot, where compromise is no longer feasible, and where we will see, this is 1848, Civil War is going to break out in 1861, just 13, barely 13 years later. So we're not far away from that. In fact, the Mexican War is where a lot of those Civil War soldiers and generals and higher-ups and officers, where a lot of them saw their first war experience. Most of them were, in the Mexican War as sergeants and privates and those kind of things, and they kind of get their first taste of battle, kind of where a lot of them gain some of their very first experience together and then end up, 12 years later fighting against each other. So that's what we'll be looking at in chapter 10, is seeing all this unravel and seeing all this excitement over this new territory erupt into conflict, particularly conflict over slavery and the political power that also included.